Hello and welcome. Good evening, good afternoon. Happy Wednesday. Happy Light 'em Up Wednesday. Welcome to all of you to yet another exciting Light 'em Up Lounge with a very special guest. Here tonight, today with us is renowned author, novelist, and drinks enthusiast, cigar writer, Aaron Goldfarb. Aaron, it's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time, being here with us, and welcome to the Light 'em Up Lounge.
Thanks for having me.
Aaron, let me ask you at the beginning for quite a few people, it always seems like the dream job. When you're in the spirits industry, when you're closely linked to the cigar industry, you're writing about the pleasures of life, the finer things of life, and everybody thinks you get a shitload of free samples, booze, and wonderful smokes sent your way, and all you pretty much do is light up the most exciting smokes and pour the most expensive bottles of scotch, cognac, or bourbon. How on earth did you actually get into this industry? And why is it not always that dream job that people would assume it possibly is?
Um, well, I do get sent a shitload of stuff, as you said. Why is it not always a dream job? Well, I currently have like 10 bottles of vodka on my desk that I don't know when I'm going to ever drink. I don't really drink vodka. I kind of got into it accidentally, like a lot of people. When I was in college, it wasn't really a job that existed. I'm sure kids today in college might be thinking, oh, that might be interesting to do, but it simply wasn't a job in the early 2000s and late 90s. Maybe there were a few major whiskey writers. There probably weren't really any cocktail writers till David Wondrich came along. Maybe a few beer writers. But I was just a fan of I think you said the finer things in life. Even when I was young and broke, I was seeking out, great whiskeys. I was very fortunate to move to New York in 2001, right as craft beer was getting big in America, right as, the cocktail renaissance was happening in New York City before spreading to the rest of America. New York's never been a great whiskey city, but whiskey and bourbon was becoming big in America right around then too. So I kind of was ushered along with that, and I just naturally had a passion and a geekiness about it. I was writing other things like screenplays and novels and whatnot, which aren't very lucrative if you're not certain people. Someone knew I knew a lot about beer and whiskey at Esquire, and asked if I'd start writing for them. And I think about the late aughts. A lot of publications were racing to get knowledgeable writers on those subjects as they were becoming trendy. And I happened to know about them, and I found I happened to like about them. And a decade plus later, I've devoted a good deal of my career to writing about drinking.
Was there in your family history, in your personal background, do you have something that where you would say like it was planted into your DNA? Is it something that you feel runs through your blood that at some point you had to sort of go back to your roots and reconnect with that history that was always there, or was it truly something that was just that you were curious about and that you got yourself into?
Well, my parents are hardly drinkers at all, and most of my people going back are never really been into drinking. They're not teetotalers or anything. They're just, my parents had, maybe a bottle of wine around the house that gathered dust that they never pulled out. But what I did innately have is a passion for, like, I don't know what you'd call it, collecting and completism. I collected sports cards as a kid and comic books and pretty much anything. And spirits for me, is kind of making that adult, trying to find that one rare bottle of whiskey, trying to, go to all these great cocktail bars you've heard about. It's a really fun thing to pursue with a real, passion to complete it all. So I did have that in my blood naturally. But I wasn't inspired by drinking in my home life. My parents still don't know anything about whiskey, and they don't drink it, and they don't know anything about my industry.
When you find yourself in an industry that has some of the most peculiar and interesting, whilst at the same time challenging products. I mean, we're dealing with alcohol, in particular for us being in the cigar industry, dealing with tobacco. That brings a lot of hurdles and obstacles with it as well. Um, how do you think about that? At the one hand, writing about life's pleasures and the wonderful things, whereas at the same time, it's always a challenging industry, and we're confronted with obstacles and hurdles that we need to overcome on a daily basis. I think we just lost Aaron for a second, but he should be back right now. Aaron, you back?
Yeah, I don't know how I got thrown out of the room. I'm sorry about that.
Not at all. So my last question was, since we're living and working in such interesting industries with products that, on one hand, are the quintessential expression of lifestyle, of luxury, of the good life, whereas at the same time, it's industries that are heavily challenged by either restrictions, and then we're dealing with alcohol and tobacco. How do you think about that, and how do you sort of balance that in your everyday life and in your work?
Yeah, I mean, these are heavily regulated industries. Someone said to me recently that actually, alcohol is a great thing in America because we've already had our prohibition. So, it can't get much worse than that. They're not probably going to go back to that. And indeed, the pandemic kind of made things go the other way. With to-go cocktails were suddenly allowed in New York. I don't know if you know that. Drinking outside suddenly became not, taboo. I know you guys can drink in Europe outside, but we really can't in America. So, cities started becoming New Orleans type in America, which was great. I don't know, but these are minor drugs we're dealing with here, so we always got to treat them respectfully and not do anything that makes them go back to that prohibition we once dealt with. I do think about that, of course, but they're meant to be fun, not things we think about all the pages of laws we have to deal with.
So speaking of fun, you earlier described how you got into the industry, how you started working with those wonderful products. Has it changed your perception and the fun of lighting up a good cigar or pouring a glass of whiskey? Because at some point it feels like work, or it becomes work, and that can probably take away some of the fun element. Is that the case for you?
A little bit. I know sports writers often say they've quit becoming fans of watching sports just because they're at the stadium every single day watching games, or movie critics watching 10 movies a day. It's got to wear on you. For me, it makes me realize what's actually great when you're sampling everything, when you get to try everything, when you don't have to be consumed by the hype of something, um, because it doesn't matter to you. Maybe you're being sent it for free, or maybe you're sampling it at a bar. So you can really find out what you really think's great, as opposed to what the average Joes out there think are great. But yeah, I suppose it is work sometimes. It's pretty fun work. It's probably a little easier than food writing, where you have to have 5 hour long tasting menus every single night. But yeah, it can wear on you.
So how did you develop your palette once you started the whole journey with your background in writing? You said you wrote about plenty of other things as well, and even things like screenplays. When you write about things that bring pleasure to other people on a sensory level, how do you continuously educate your palate in order to be able to dissect all these little details and the fine nuances, and translate that into the written pieces then that other people enjoy as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I wouldn't say I have one of the world's great palates by any stretch of the imagination. But I think tasting is really an intellectual exercise. First of all, you got to taste lots of things that aren't just alcohol. You need to know what all these obscure, herbs or spices or fruits taste like, separate from where they're typically served, so you have the mental capacity to even know that's what you're tasting. You also need to have the ability to describe what you're tasting. It's I think most people can say this tastes good to me or this tastes bad to me, but how do you describe why it tastes good to you or why it tastes interesting to you or what you're tasting? That's a lifetime thing you practice. The more you do it, the more you really sit there thinking about what you're drinking and what it tastes like, the better you get at it. And of course, most of us, myself included, we're not thinking when we're drinking. We're drinking a beer while watching the game. We're drinking a cocktail while hanging out with friends. We're not, closing our eyes and really thinking hard. Oh, what does this aroma remind me of? What does this taste remind me of? And that can get obnoxious when you're out with your friends if you're thinking too hard about what it tastes like. You just want to have fun. But if you are doing serious tasting, you do need to kind of, as opposed to just going from your nose and mouth, go to your brain and think really hard about turning that scent, that taste into your brain and then coming back out to your mouth to describe it. It's a real intellectual thing.
I think that's very interesting that you sort of describe it as an intellectual exercise, much rather than just a sensory exercise where you think about all the aromas and flavors. And ultimately, it comes down to verbalizing these things and finding the right language, the right terminology in order to express what you're perceiving, which is also the wonderful thing about it because it gives us the opportunity to come together and share those experiences and make them meaningful to other people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, everyone's drank a glass of whiskey or something. Oh, what is that I'm tasting? And then finally someone says, oh, that's I think it's root beer. That's whatever. Oh yeah, that's it. So I think anyone can be a pretty good taster. You just need the practice of doing it and then describing it to other people. So many people will make fun of wine connoisseurs naming all these absurd fruits in their wine, but these people do it every day, so they've developed a vocabulary for it. When if all you do is go out and drink wine, which is perfectly fine, you haven't gotten the practice for how to do such a thing.
How do you actually think about that personally when you write about food, when you write about drinks, when you write about cigars? I somehow feel like there's two different camps where the one group might say, look, it tastes like tobacco or it tastes like wine, and then others go into those very floral, fancy, funky descriptions that seem quite odd to a lot of people. Which one do you rather relate to, or do you find the sort of the golden middle way to be the right path?
I personally, I don't love reading other people's tasting notes unless I'm tasting, at the same time, going, oh, okay, I get that. And of course, there's the element of you can kind of cheat tasting notes, especially with something like bourbon. It only has, tell me about a bourbon that I've never tasted. I can tell you it probably has caramel notes, vanilla notes. It's pretty easy to do. The same goes for lots of other spirits. They're going to have kind of those archetypal notes. So, once you know that, you can kind of cheat your tasting notes a bit. Yeah, some people's tasting notes are patently absurd. They include things that person has never encountered in their life, fruits you've never heard of, desserts that aren't served, So, that can be a little pretentious and ridiculous to describe tasting notes, that the average person would never encounter, a boysenberry or whatever the hell. I think you can do tasting notes in a more approachable way.
Tell us a little bit more about your beginnings of the whole journey, and also how New York City probably has played into that. I know when you started writing as a profession, New York City was really booming. The spirits industry was bubbling. The cocktail scene was just on the edge of its renaissance, and sort of that second golden era that we all experienced. Obviously, me being a bartender myself, we all were excited about what was going on back then. Um, was it like that transition for you, and the perfect time and place in order to grow into this industry more?
Yeah, I was very lucky with that. I moved to New York in 2000, and I think Milk and Honey opened in 1999. And then, as we move to the latter 2000s, you see stuff like Clover Club and PDT, Death and Co. A lot of what would become world famous cocktail bars that would define the industry even today were opening up. I don't recall us thinking like a revolution was going on because, as I said, people weren't really writing about cocktails in 2009 when PDT opened. Some people were, but now any bar opens for one day, it's like, gets like 40 stories about it. So yeah, just kind of going to those bars and being, I guess I didn't even know a revolution was going on because, as I said, I moved to New York when it was going on. So it always seemed normal to me that bars had, incredible old fashions or, beautiful glassware or that drinks were jiggered. That would have felt weirder to someone 10 years older than me who'd lived through, the late 80s and 90s of whatever, Harvey Wallbangers and cheesy shots and whatnot. You would have, they would have really gone, oh wow, this is quite different than what I was drinking in my 20s. And of course, I drank plenty of crap in my 20s too. I don't want to act like I was just drinking $15 cocktails when I was 22 years old. But yeah, if you were interested in that stuff, and I was, you couldn't help but kind of get your education along the way. And I'm, in retrospect, really grateful for how lucky I was. I mean, if I'd lived in Kansas City at the time, or if I'd lived in Dallas at the time, I don't think I would have gotten that education so quickly.
At the same time, the cigar industry was in a very interesting moment in time as well. Obviously, with the boom in the late '90s, and then sort of the bust thereafter. You lived through that as well. And how in general did cigars come into the picture for you as well? Because you every now and then write about cigars, obviously enjoy them on your own as a as a hobby and even part of your profession. Where did that come into the overall picture?
Cigars were something I always enjoyed. They went perfect with, the good life we're continually talking about, but it was not something I ever had, a connoisseurship about, even today. New York's also always been a very weird city for cigar smoking because there's not a lot of indoor space where it's allowed, especially I think around maybe 2002, smoking indoors at bars became illegal in New York. And suddenly there were like literally only 2 or 3 places in all of New York City that had a license to smoke cigars. And those are extremely high end places that, Arnold Schwarzenegger would smoke at when he was in Manhattan. So, I remember it always being a struggle to find places to smoke cigars in New York. Winter, don't even think about it. So I'd get, my year's supply of smoking done in the summer in New York at that era. I think it's getting a little better now. But I've always said New York's not a great cigar smoking city. I mean, people probably debate me on that. And as I said, I'm not exactly a connoisseur on the matter, but it's always been a struggle to find, average places to smoke cigars.
What was it that sparked your interest for smoking cigars, though?
I guess maybe I was a little pretentious when I was young and thought, wow, that looks cool to, have a glass of scotch and a cigar, and it's trite but true. That just seemed like being a man living the good life, and I certainly wasn't living the good life. I was a broke 25-year-old, but that seemed like a quick and fairly cheap way to kind of elevate me to that good life I so aspired to.
Uh, Interestingly enough, I sort of had a similar encounter or similar experience because when I turned 18, I put on a black suit. I went to a local cozy old school American bar in the city center in Vienna, lit up my very first cigar ever, which back then was a cheap machine made cigar. And I had my first cocktail, which was full of cream and sugar, obviously, because it makes it easier to digest. But what I somehow subconsciously understood back then is how close these products are, and still to this day, this is what truly fascinates me. And I believe you've probably experienced the same, that food and drink and handmade traditional products like a cigar, to me, are the quintessential expression of human nature and culture and history and geography. And that I find to be most interesting and inspiring to a certain extent. And that close connection between those industries is something that I'm super curious about still to this very day.
Yeah, I mean, here in America, I'm not sure how it was in Europe and the rest of the world. The 80s and 90s I grew up in were all about the opposite of handmade things, microwave dinners, you know, bottled wine coolers and sodas, prepackaged cigars, the Swisher Sweets and Philly Blunts and stuff. So in the 2000s, when kind of that Brooklyn hipster aesthetic of like we hand make everything, whether it's ketchup, beer, mayonnaise, whiskey, cigar, whatever, that was a real reaction to what we'd experienced in America during the 80s and 90s, Budweiser, so now we were going to make IPAs, all this mass produced stuff was getting pushed out of way by my generation and people slightly older than me who wanted to go back to this maker tradition of fine crafted things that honestly didn't cost a lot more money. An IPA made by a small brewery in Brooklyn might have cost $2 more than a Bud Light, but it was so much better. And the $12 cocktail PDT was so much better than the $10 vodka tonic at the sports bar. So that was a very exciting time, and to people 10, 15 years younger than me, I don't think they can imagine a world where you can't get handcrafted stuff everywhere, whether it's an airport or a sports bar or wherever. It's just how the world has become in most places. The idea of cheap mass produced stuff still exists, obviously, but a lot of people have kind of pushed it aside in favor of better made stuff. Although you could say that's getting torn apart right now because of the pandemic with all these canned cocktails and alcoholic seltzers and whatnot, but I hope not.
It almost feels like it's two different dynamics that are pulling apart. On the one hand, we're living in a truly fast-paced, very dynamic world where everything becomes uniform and mushed into the very same thing globally with no differentiation and no finesse or class. Whilst at the other hand, exactly what you were describing is happening, that the younger generation is now more interested again in handcrafted products, maybe traditional products, old school techniques and stuff. And you experienced it firsthand, like myself, as a young generation, probably at the age of 18, 20, suddenly developing that interest in such products. Why do you think is that, or how do you relate to that, and how do you capture young people's attention now, also through your writing work, in order to make them aware of all these beautiful products and about these handcrafted things that can mean so much?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the younger generation cares a lot more about sustainability, the environment, workers' rights, and stuff. And a lot of these craft products are inherently in favor of all those things. It affects the environment a lot less to use stuff in your backyard to distill or make beer. Um, Workers often have better rights at these smaller places that aren't run by, international conglomerates that want to destroy everything. I don't know. At the same time, though, the younger generation is the one that's driven the sales of alcoholic seltzer here in America, and I believe the world, which are owned by international conglomerates. So I don't know. I don't think a lot of these younger people care as much necessarily about the artistry because they were born into it. Maybe they'll care in 20 years when we lose all of it again and have to go back. But it's easier to think, wow, I love these craft beers. I love this great whiskey. I love these handmade cigars when that didn't exist. But now that all these people entered a world where it was ubiquitous, I'm not sure if they have as much interest in saving it. I hope I'm wrong.
Would you say that this is also the responsibility of media professionals and authors like yourself to make sure that we constantly communicate and send out these messages to the world and make people aware of what's actually happening, what's out there?
Yeah, I mean it's slightly dangerous. I don't know if that's the right word to for a journalist to just be the industry's cheerleader. But at the same time, yeah, you got to talk about what's going on. It's great, and you got to ding the stuff that you don't think's great. I don't know why so many people are continuing to write alcoholic seltzer stories. I guess because people want to read them. But I think, we got into an industry where we're trying to talk about all the great stuff going on, all the innovative stuff going on. And, every day there's more stories about this brand releasing an alcoholic seltzer. And it just doesn't interest me at all. And I don't know why so many writers who truly care about great products continue to write about it. I'm sure there's someone here who likes craft hard seltzer who's pissed at me for continuing to rip on it, but that's how I feel.
So this might be, or it might sound like a bit of a controversial question, and it certainly is not, but would you say that being an author, being a writer about these things is more of an ego thing because you care about it and you want to write about it simply the way you do it, or is it more of a serving act to the audience out there? And I would almost bring up an analogy with all the master blenders that we have on the show, with all the manufacturers and brand owners. We often talk about whether they produce a fine cigar or a fine beverage according to their own preferences and simply because they want to bring something to the world the way they enjoy it, or is it more about listening to the audience and thinking about what would other people enjoy?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. I mean, I think to a certain extent, and I hate to say it, writing is always an ego thing. You have to be a certain kind of egomaniac to think anyone on planet Earth wants to read what you have to say, right? Um, Having said that, you're hopefully aligning your ego for what you find interesting with what lots of other people find interesting. I have no interest in writing things about things that don't interest me, but that I know will interest other people. Um, Someone else can handle that job. I don't think I've ever written a hard seltzer story. It just doesn't interest me. When it comes to producers, I've been very sad to see so many craft breweries making hard seltzers just because they know they'll sell. You know, that's my problem though. They're a business and they need to make money. But the craft beer renaissance in America was started on saying we're not going to make stuff for the masses. We're not going to make lowest common denominator stuff. We're going to make, bitter IPAs and boozy stouts and whatnot. And we're never going to become as big as Budweiser, but you're going to learn to like these things that we love. And it worked. But now you're seeing a monoculture of breweries producing strictly IPAs and, fruited sours and seltzers just because those are the easiest sell. Again, I get that these are businesses and they need to make money, especially during a very challenging, year and a half. But at the same time, I think a lot of those people didn't get in the business just to make stuff that they don't enjoy. You see it with distilleries too, that pump out vodkas that probably give them no sorts of pleasure or passion just because they think they can sell them and they're easy to make. I don't know. You got to somehow be in the middle where you're producing work that truly interests you and that you think doesn't exist in the world, and making a living.
Which is exactly the same thing for an author like
Right.
yourself, right? Because you also have to make a living off of it and find that balance as to how do you actually deal with the industry, how do you write and talk about certain products, and how do you keep your independence and all that.
Yeah, I mean, that is one nice thing about being a writer, especially a freelance writer like me, is I can write what I want and accept what I want. I kind of dictate my income. I'm never going to make $1 zillion a year writing stuff like that, but if I produce enough work, I can make a good living and be in control of my life and produce things that I want to produce. That doesn't mean you're not going to read bad stories from me occasionally, though, and stories I'm not proud of, but try my best.
Our dear friend Ian, who's here with us at the lounge, he has a question for you.
Okay.
Hi, Aaron. Just actually a few miscellaneous things. And you mentioned at the start about there not being any books. I've actually got one which came out in 1976 by a guy called John Docksat, called Stirred Not Shaken. I don't know if you've come across that. It's about the dry martini. He's a very good, and I thoroughly recommend that to anybody if you can get hold of it. I picked it up about 40 years ago and really enjoyed it. I had a question actually. In lockdown, I've taken to sort of making old fashions. What's your recipe for your favorite old fashioned? What whiskey would you use, and how would you go about making it?
I like to play around with old fashions. I'm not sure if I have a favorite recipe. I typically will do, start with kind of a ratio of 2 ounces of alcohol, about, half ounce of sweetener, and that can be anything. I like Demerara syrup, which is just Demerara sugar and water. But I also use maple syrup in the winter for that. You can tweak it to get your sweetness levels and booze levels. As mentioned earlier, I'm very lucky. I get sent a lot of alcohol, so I can make cocktails with more expensive of whiskeys than your average person just because I have so much sitting around. But I usually like a higher proof rye or bourbon that can really, cut through. Something, on the more affordable scale would be like an old Overholt bonded rye wise, or, even old Granddad, I think makes a good one. More expensive wise, maybe like Russell's Reserve, which is Wild Turkey's higher end stuff. But the old fashioned is so great because it's such an easy cocktail to play around with. There's only 3 moving parts with booze, sweetener, and bitters, so you can really insert anything. You can use honey instead of maple syrup, use that as the sweetener. Really, any sort of sweetener you have, you can swap it in for that 0.5 or whatever ounces. Any whiskey or spirits, I make rum old fashions even. And then, bitters, knock yourself out. Yeah, exactly. But
yeah, I've been experimenting with Rittenhouse and with Woodford, which again are not hugely expensive. If you use a better spirit, is it actually worth doing, or does it just get lost with the sweetness and the rest of it? Because I wouldn't want to put $100 whiskey into an old fashioned.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't do a $100 whiskey into an old fashioned either. I think, to a certain level, maybe up to a $50 bottle, you might get it. But, you mentioned Rittenhouse, that's a $20 bottle in America, and you're not going to do much better than that, flavor wise. But yeah, there's also bad whiskeys at the lower price point. So yeah, it really is something you can play around and kind of personalize, because there's endless combinations, for what you like. Stir it, get it cold, use a good glass that feels nice in your hand, and good ice too. Use the big silicone cube holders, where you can make the big ice. Yeah, and always works. Also, chill your glassware is a little secret that a lot of people don't do. Just put the glass into the freezer, before you're gonna have an old fashioned.
Would you chill your spirits? I mean, when I do gin and tonic, I put the gin in the freezer, the tonic in the fridge, and I don't need ice. But I mean, would you put the whiskey in the freezer or in the fridge before you used it, or not?
I typically don't do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I kind of like how spirits get a little more syrupy when they're in the freezer. I don't do it, but I think it's fine. I've never had an iceless gin and tonic. I'm certainly going to try that now, though. I'm not a huge fan of ice, quite frankly, so I like that concept.
Yeah, I mean the tonic warms it up, so the ice would warm it up because it.
Right. Yeah.
Minus
like
18 in the freezer. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Even though ice, interestingly enough, is I believe an ingredient that's often overlooked, and
yeah.
It amazes me how people would care so much about all the spirits and flavoring parts and modifiers in the drink, and then you have crappy little pieces of ice with holes in there, and all they do is dilute your perfectly assembled drink in a matter of seconds, right? So that's probably a good tip for all the people who are mixing drinks at home. Make sure that you have quality ice. And by all means, I think the easiest option is to take a plastic container, like a Tupper box or something, fill it with water and put it into your fridge. And it will give you solid blocks of ice that you can work with, because dilution is key.
Yeah, I mean, that's the easiest thing to know that you're at a crappy bar when you get bad ice with your cocktail. That's an immediate sign that you're not at a bar that's as good as they think they might be, especially here in New York, for sure.
Aaron, one thing that I always loved about your writing, your various stories, be it about cigars or spirits, is how approachable you make things. And with your book, Hacking Whiskey, or with some of your articles, in particular the cigar ones, where you described yourself as not being a connoisseur earlier, which I wouldn't agree with, but from that perspective and from that position, you make it very approachable for other people who probably also would not call themselves apasionados, aficionados, connoisseurs, whatever that be. Is that something that's just deeply engraved in your writing DNA, or the way you like to write, or is it because you have those people in mind that you're ultimately writing those pieces for?
Well, it's how I like to write. And people fall asleep if you're getting too, technical and pretentious with them. A lot of people just want to know, is this a good product? Is it interesting? Is it going to, make my life better? They don't want to be kind of condescended to in writing, and I don't either. So, I'm not saying when I'm with other whiskey experts, we're not kind of talking in a real kind of, nerdy intellectual way. But, when you're writing for the masses, and if you want your stories to be read by a lot of people in your book, you got to, relate to them. People at bars talk in very, very kind of plain ways. And that's how I want to write too. I mean, alcohol is supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to make you feel bad about your lack of knowledge.
And same true.
Cigars too, yeah. Right.
Obviously. Which publications do you primarily write cigar content for as well, not just the spirit side?
I haven't written a lot of cigar content in a while. I have a long-standing relationship the Shanken line of magazines. So I've written for all of them, Whiskey Advocate and Cigar Aficionado and whatnot. Esquire too, although I can't recall the last cigar story I wrote for them. It's harder these days to get cigar stories in mainstream publications in America. By mainstream, I mean, Esquire, New York Times. Smoking is still, kind of taboo here in America. It's I don't know if I'd say looked down upon, but it's something that, the New York Times is going to have a story about cigars every day of the week, maybe not once a month even. So you got to find that thing that makes it an interesting story that a mainstream publisher will publish.
I believe one aspect of both spirits and cigars that people are really fond of is the concept of pairing them and enhancing the experience with one and the other. How do you think about the whole pairing concept when it comes to cigars and high proof alcohol?
Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on that. My friend Clay Whitaker is a expert on that, and I think he writes a column on pairing for Bourbon Plus magazine here, which is a nice magazine to grab. I've always, cigar is a flavor note in lots of whiskeys, of course. So that makes it easy. You can also obviously pair kind of conversely, something lighter and fruitier with something more robust. I've always kind of like pairing the sock yourself over the head pairing, aggressive whiskey with an aggressive cigar, which I know not a lot of people do that pairing, but I've always enjoyed that kind of pairing. As I said, I'm not a pairing expert though. Ian's shaking his head at me.
I think Ian thoroughly enjoys his cigars with a strong beverage on the side, as probably a lot of other people who are here with us. But the one thing that I find challenging is, as you rightfully said, both of them are strong characters, and it can be a challenge where a cigar already gives you a lot of bitter components, gives
Right.
you things to work with on a sensory level. And then if you pair it with a rather challenging beverage, it becomes more a clash of the titans much rather than a smooth relationship.
Yeah, I honestly think kind of into the night cocktails can be a good pairing. A Manhattan would be the most typical pairing that can work out. I also think Amaro is kind of a good pairing that not a lot of people talk about. Maybe in cigar circles, people are talking about that by now, but I think that can be a nice pairing, a darker, robust Amaro, like say, yeah, exactly. A Verna, maybe a little sweet, but yeah.
And also, I think sweet wines or fortified wines work a treat. Like sherry gives you just so much variety to play with, from an elegant, crisp fino or mineral manzanilla all the way to a very luscious, deep, rich Pedro Jimenez, and even ports, obviously. So I think that's very interesting to look into as well.
Yeah, and those aren't going to deaden your tongue as much as barrel proof whiskey too. So I agree with you on that.
Aaron, tell us a little bit about your novel writing. The short stories and essays like Drunk Drinking is something that I thoroughly enjoy, and these are a different take on things. And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, let's see. I haven't published a novel since 2014. My novels were always about, kind of fuck ups living in New York, for a lack of a better word. Young men and women trying to make their way in New York City. I haven't read any of my novels in 5 years plus, so it almost seems like a different life that I not my part of my own life. I suppose I could read them and it'd feel like reading another author. But I would like to get back into novel writing. It's not a particularly lucrative field unless you write about wizards or vampires or whatnot. And I always wrote more kind of dark satires that are taking place in New York City. But yeah, I don't know. I can't necessarily recommend my novels, but I can't not recommend them. People are still reading them, and I still get notes. But it feels like I'm getting notes of praise to another author. As I said, it feels like a lifetime ago, even though it wasn't that long ago that I was writing those. But I'd like to get back into writing novels for sure.
You mentioned a very interesting aspect when you say when revisiting some of your older pieces of art and writing, it can almost feel like somebody else's
Yeah.
work. Do you do that every now and then, revisiting some of your old articles and publications just in order to sort of think about what the state of mind you were in back then?
Well, not necessarily for the state of mind, but frequently I'll be researching a current thing I'm working on, and through the magic of Google, I'll accidentally end up reading my own thing. And sometimes I don't even remember I wrote it, and I'm going, okay, that's it. Oh, I wrote this one. Okay. Because, to be a writer that earns an income, you kind of have to write and move on to the next thing, keep your head down. But, I'll occasionally remember an old story I wrote. Oh, I wonder what that reads like. And, I've seen my style change a bit. It's kind of got a little less brash and almost rude and snarky. I guess that's just age taking over and maturity. But yeah, I'll go back and read old stuff, not for kind of an ego boost, just to see what I thought of things back then. And a lot of them make you cringe, but occasionally you'll go, okay, that was pretty good.
And also what's very interesting, obviously the spirits landscape has changed dramatically ever since you started in the early 2000s, and so has the cigar landscape. But most importantly, media has changed dramatically, and the rise of new media and social media has certainly affected those industries to a large degree. How do you feel and think about that evolution of media and the role that it plays in conjunction with these industries?
Yeah. Well, the last 10 years is I've obviously seen a lot of major publications close down, a lot of print go to online only or whatnot. But you've also seen the rise of a lot of great kind of niche publications. Here in America, you've seen a ton of new beer websites and spirits websites and cocktail websites and wine websites. And these are not meant for mass audiences. They might get tens of thousands of readers a day as opposed to hundreds of thousands or millions, but they are still read by the people you want to read them. And they pay writers better than you'd probably imagine. Some of my worst paying gigs have been from major publications that you would think pay pretty well. But these niche publications are great. They're filling a void that people wanted to hear about. And those closed too. Lucky Peach was a great food magazine in New York that ran for about a decade and closed, and people still remember fondly. And I've written for places that have closed, and every year new places open up and ask me to write stories for them. So it's kind of just rolling with the punches if you want to be a full-time writer in this field. I'm still optimistic about journalism, so.
And obviously also optimistic about people still reading printed stuff and not just online.
Maybe.
Having a book in hand, feeling paper.
I don't know if people want to buy magazines or newspapers anymore, but books do still excite people. Print books. I see Ian had his Kindle, but my books sell very well in print. Books sold incredibly well in America during the pandemic, and especially cocktail books and spirits books. They look great. They're fun to hold, and they look great on your shelf. So yeah, books are doing well, at least for me, and I think quite a few other people in my field.
I also feel that, that tactile sensation as
Yeah.
a sensory component of overall experience is definitely something that factors into that as well.
Yeah, I was one of the earliest adopters for ebooks. I was reading ebooks in like maybe 2008 or 9, but I quickly they were hurting my reading. I felt like I was reading less, I wasn't enjoying it as much, and I shifted back completely to paperbacks and hardbacks probably in, I don't know, 2012 or so, and that's all I read now, and it's much more enjoyable to me. I don't hold it against anyone, of course, who reads ebooks. That might be right for you, but yeah, and I think a lot of people are that way too. We stare at our screens all day long, computers and phones, that to, sit in a chair, sit on the subway reading a paperback does feel like a bit of a pleasure these days.
Just a few brief questions that our dear friends and family here had in the audience. Cy Sweeney was asking whether you read Michael Jackson's Malt Whiskey Companion and if you tasted many of the whiskeys that Michael included in his books. And then there was also a question about aniseed spirits and ouzo, and whether that is something that you're fond of as well, with or without cigars.
Um, yeah, I've read all of Michael Jackson stuff, and I still read some of his dispatches. I think it's his website where they're online. I remember the day he died. Actually, I was sitting at a bar on 34th Street, so that was a great loss. And of course, he was writing during that time when I claimed there was not a lot of alcohol writing. Anna spirits, I like them. I don't drink them a lot. Not because I dislike them, just because I don't know. Maybe I'm an American and they're not prevalent here necessarily. But yeah, I like them. Anise wise, I love a Sazerac. That gets kind of the best of both worlds for me. You get Pernod or absinthe with spirits, and that'd probably be a pretty good cigar pairing, I'd imagine. Maybe a little boozy.
Now, before we come to an end for today, Aaron, what I'd be interested in is if you take a little glimpse into the crystal ball together with me and look at the spirits industry, how it evolved ever since you started. You spoke about the cigar industry quite a bit, and obviously media, even though that's a very broad term. What would you wish for in the near future in order for those industries to improve and all of us coming closer together as aficionados, pasionados, or just people who enjoy those finer things in life?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think by now everyone's aware of the finer things in life. Airport bars have incredible whiskey lists and whatnot, but I think you're seeing a lot of places trying to, they're kind of bastardizing all these great things by, in search of the, quick buck, whether that's quickly producing tequila and mezcal, whether that's, cranking out canned and bottled cocktails that aren't up to snuff, whether that's hard seltzer again. So I wish and I hope people remember how bad it was in, the 80s and 90s, and they think about that, and they think about how we got to that point where, after prohibition in America, it got to the point where there were like 15 breweries in America, 10 distilleries, and they were all producing similar stuff. So I don't think that's going to happen again. There's 8,000 breweries in America at the moment. I think maybe 9,000, over 1,000 distilleries. But there's always the chance if people quit trying to make distinctive stuff and interesting stuff, that we could get into that monoculture of kind of crap that took over in America and a lot of the world back then. So I wish people would make things and produce things that they have a passion for and they enjoy, as opposed to simply stuff that they think's currently within the zeitgeist and that, can make them a quick buck.
Would you have like a general recommendation for people out there in order to make more out of their smoking or drinking experiences?
Um, that's a good point. I think your point about ice at home is great for cocktails. My point I raised earlier about chilling your glassware, you want to make a martini that's as good as a martini at top London bars. You need to chill your coupe. Getting better glassware too. How often do you go to someone's house and they, pour you a drink and something that you shouldn't be drinking out of? Part of it is just aesthetics, but those aesthetics are very important. I think those are some of the bigger things. Anyone can buy a nice bottle of booze, but to serve it at that way that top hospitalitarians do, that takes a little more effort, and it's something that can really up your game, in my opinion.
Attention to detail. And
Attention to detail, exactly.
that ultimately matter.
Yeah. Yep.
So on a more personal level, what's installed for you, and where do you see yourself evolving and growing into over the next couple of years?
Well, I just took a trip to Oaxaca, so my latest passion is mezcal, which is very tricky to learn. At least I'm struggling to. It seems like whiskey is so much easier to understand. So that's what I'm currently interested in. I know, of course, Americans are ruining mezcal like we've ruined lots of other spirits from other places in the world, but hopefully we don't ruin it too much, because I finally really gotten into it. But the pandemic has given me a chance to explore all these great spirits aside from whiskey, whether it's rums the world over, great brandies. I'm really into Armagnac right now. All stuff like that, agave spirits too. So there's an endless world of great stuff to explore, and you need thousands of lifetimes to taste it all and learn about it all. But I want to try to get as much done as I can in this one lifetime.
That most certainly is a wonderful statement, and yeah, a good thought to leave us all with for the rest of the week. Aaron, it's been such a pleasure to have you, and many thanks for sharing some of your personal insights, your story, and also the way you think about these wonderful products we all love to enjoy, and that bring us all together. And that's the beauty, I think, of drinks and food and cigars in general. They are humble products that bring us all together and make us enjoy the camaraderie and the community, and sort of recalibrate our values in life every now and then. So I couldn't thank you enough, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have you tonight.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely right. They are humble products, but they do so much for us.
So people can find you ideally, I guess, via aarongoldfarb.com. All your books and links around there. So for all of you, if you'd like to learn more about Aaron's writing, his novels, short stories and essays, you can find links to that on the website, I believe, and definitely be on the lookout for his articles on Esquire, Punch, Wine Pair. Any other links or platforms where people could find you?
No, I'm Aaron Goldfarb on most social media. I don't tweet that often, but I do tweet my newest articles, and Instagram. You can see what I'm drinking at the moment. So check me out there.
Brilliant. Aaron, it's been an absolute pleasure. Many thanks. All the very best to you, and also to your family. And I'm looking forward to hopefully sharing a cigar and a great drink with you in the very near future.
I would love to. Look me up next time you're in New York City, please. Any of you.
Most definitely. Aaron, all the very best to you, and to all of you, have a fabulous Wednesday. We'll see each other again next week, where we have Mitchell Orchant with us, fabulous chap from the UK. And now with this new endeavor, Dominique, London, that's most definitely going to be a very interesting conversation as well. All the very best. Take care. Light them up. And Aaron, again, thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks so
Goodbye.
much. Bye.